Bruce Springsteen has been releasing music since he was 23 years old. That means we've essentially gotten to watch him grow up on record. In the early 1970s, we saw him write music driven by sheer youthful exuberance. In the late 1970s and 1980s, we saw the starburst of his youthful exuberance fade, and watched him wrestle with the darkness of his country, his family, and his own soul. In the 1990s, we watched him willfully, if uneasily, embrace the responsibilities of adulthood, and it seemed like music had become a distant second priority. And then came 2001. In his autobiography, Springsteen recalled how on the evening of September 11th, 2001, a plea came from a fan. Just then, a car careening off Rumson's Seabright Bridge shot past, its window down, and its driver, recognizing me, shouted, "Bruce, we need you." The injunction would kick off Bruce Springsteen's most fertile decade. In the 2000s, he released 5 studio albums, racked up 12 Grammys and a Golden Globe, lit up and tore down Giant Stadium, played the Super Bowl halftime show, and received Kennedy Center honors from President Barack Obama. If Springsteen's sparse 1990s worried anybody that he'd lost his motivation, his fiery 2000s should make just the opposite case. So before we get going, please do me the favor of liking this video and subscribing to my page. Transparently, YouTube pays me for how well I engage my audience, so when you click those little buttons, you effectively put $1 in my tip jar without spending any actual money. Wow. Lastly, I spent last week arranging and recording a cover of Nebraska, which you can now see on my page.
You wanna know why I did what I did? Sir, I guess it's just a meanness in this world.
If you're sick of hearing me judge legendary material, now's your chance to judge me. Okay, Springsteen 2000 studio album tier list. Let's go. #12, The Rising. What The Rising really is a cast for the bone in America that was broken by September 11th. As I was re-listening to this album, a big question in my head is a cast that was created for a past tragedy still relevant, decades after the tragedy took place? One answer is that you never really heal from a tragedy like that. Like, yes, Ground Zero has scarred over with new buildings and new art pieces and so forth, but the scar never goes away. You never really stop feeling soreness around the area you were wounded. And indeed, people's families, people's careers, people's lives were irrevocably changed by the events of that day. So, life perseveres, America has gone on, but it's impossible to ever stop feeling the ripple effects from that tragedy. But the other thing is that it's not like violence like this has stopped happening all over the world. I happen to be re-listening to this on a morning after the new violence in the Middle East started taking place. There are people who will argue that the violence is necessary. There are people that will argue that it's not necessary. But one thing we can all be sure of is that it will create new generational cultural pain for people. People will hurt as a result of it. And one of the main purposes of music is to dress and heal cultural pain like that. Whether it's Woody Guthrie writing about people fleeing Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl, or Rodriguez's songs being used in anti-apartheid movements, or gangster rappers rapping about police brutality. When a culture is wounded, it effectively sends up the bat signal for the musicians of the day to help address those wounds. I was listening to this album the day that new violence in the Middle East started taking place, and I was tremendously moved. The approach that Springsteen takes to writing about the tragedy on 9/11 is one that we should be familiar with by now, where he tries to view it from every human perspective imaginable, whether that's the spouses or the family members of first responders for 9/11, whether that's entire communities trying to rally and have a good time after 9/11, like in Mary's Place, whether that's the people who carried out the tragedy or tragedies like it, like in Paradise, where Springsteen writes from the perspective of a suicide bomber, whether that's from the perspective of somebody who died in a tragedy like this, which he does later in Paradise. Springsteen's effort here is to imagine every possible instance, iteration, incarnation of human pain that resulted from a tragedy like this, and to write into it, and in so doing, hopefully take a step toward healing it. Transparently, when I was listening to this a couple of weeks ago, I found myself weeping at the difficulty but necessity with which cultures have to rise after they've suffered a tragedy like that. Weeping at the atmosphere of lonesomeness that people have to breathe after something like this has taken place. And, the sort of metaphor of the smoke billowing into the air, the ash, the dust billowing into the air after the attacks, that becomes the air that we all breathe in the aftermath. Somebody in the comments for one of these past videos was talking about the unity that Bruce Springsteen was trying to write about and kind of bring about via The Rising as being an impossible unity, a sort of idealistic unity that we'll never actually see. That may be true, but two things should prevent you from interpreting that as a reason to become more cynical. First of all of us have to continue living our lives in the aftermath of tragedy. You have no choice but to find a way forward. In order to find a way forward, you need something to be walking toward. You need a hopeful vision in order to move forward. And I think Springsteen's effort in this album is to create that hopeful vision, not necessarily to say that world peace, permanent world peace and world happiness is possible, but that there may be a sunny day ahead of you, and it's worth getting up that day to see if today's the day. The majority of this album moves me that way, and there are a few songs that move me in a particularly intense way. The first is The Rising. I watched this video of him performing it in Barcelona in 2002, I believe. Watching the way that he was playing guitar, just the sort of consistent, almost John Henry-like motion of his arm, it made me see him as like the American factories that he's spent so much of his career writing about. The production lines that are producing the backbone of America, the infrastructure of America, day in and day out, whether they want to or not. That performance of The Rising made me see him as a sort of factory of human hope, and not bullshit hope, not promises that will not come true, but promises that if you work toward them have a chance of coming true. It made me brim over with gratitude. The Rising was one. The second is Paradise. Springsteen has repeatedly made it a project in his songwriting to write from perspectives that are not easy to get into, like Charles Starkweather in The Serial Killer in Nebraska, or like his father, who in a variety of different ways was pretty abusive toward him, or in the case of Paradise, a suicide bomber, and then later in the song, the spirit of somebody who died who's visiting his former spouse. It's a riskier song than may meet the eye because it's talking about paradise as an empty promise, both for the person who commits atrocities like this under the promise that they'll get to paradise by doing it, but then also it's sort of poking a hole in the idea that the person is in a better place. I think it's saying that the best place is here together. The implication of that message is not that you should be hopeless that the person you love died for nothing, but that you have the blessing of still being here with your fellow humans, and therefore that you should seek to make this here now as good as it can possibly be. And then the one that I am most moved by is Into the Fire. Into the Fire is from the perspective of a spouse or a family member of a first responder who died in 9/11. The unifying image of the song is the first responder, instead of saving their own life, going upstairs into the deadly flames in the Twin Towers. And in doing so, making the ultimate sacrifice, putting their own life at risk and probably giving their own life so that they might have the chance of saving more lives than just their own. From a compositional perspective, I just find the refrain simple and moving in a way that many of the refrains on Tunnel of Love are, like two faces, two faces have I, upstairs into the fire. Very economy of language that just is right on the nerve of the thing it's talking about. The prayer of the song is just so intensely moving. I hope that the quality of your actions give you another life in all of us. The strength that you exhibit, the faith, the hope that you exhibit in making that sacrifice, I hope that we too can act in those ways, and in so doing give you another life. If you lost somebody that day, or if you've ever lost somebody in a way that felt premature, you hope that their soul leaving the planet isn't the end of them, that you can carry them with you in some way, and ideally by carrying out their best qualities. And the additional reason why it was so moving to me that day is because I was thinking about, whether you feel that any of this violence is warranted at all. What continues to be true is that the people who order this violence to take place are not the ones who carry it out. And therefore, they are expecting normal people, citizens of their society who have filial piety, to make the ultimate sacrifice on their behalf. They're not sacrificing anything. They're likely only being enriched by moments like this. As you grieve the person you lost, you also feel this intense sadness at that dynamic, at the unfairness and, arguably the unrighteousness of that dynamic. Things to mourn, things to mourn. And this music gives you a channel by which to mourn those things. To the initial question of whether a cast that was made for a broken bone that has since healed is still as necessary as it was at that moment. In the case of The Rising, the answer for me is yes. It helps that I know Springsteen's story. It helps that I know what he was up against personally, artistically. It helps that for most of my life I've lived very close to, if not in, New York City, and so I feel the reverberations of those attacks in ways that others might not. And it helped that I listened to it at a moment when there was a new gash of global pain opened up by another series of rulers trying to make whatever points they felt needed making in the world. As I listen to this album now, its human points of view are as moving as I have to imagine they were when it first came out. Is it a little bit too long? Yes. Does it sound a little bit like a former rock legend trying to find a new rock sound and not always hitting the mark? Yes. I don't listen to this nearly as much as my favorite Springsteen albums, but I am as moved by its best songs as any Springsteen songs I'm moved by. I don't know of another more compassionate or more effective healing take on 9/11 from a major musician. I would put it in the very lowest place of his A tier. 13. Devils and Dust. Devils and Dust is largely compiled from songs Springsteen wrote and recorded in previous phases of his career, from as recently as the Rising Tour to as far back as the early 1990s. Perhaps surprisingly, this is one of his best sounding albums. He creates this atmosphere of incredibly warm, tender, intimate folk rock. It is probably as atmospherically rewarding an album as he's made since Nebraska. If you want good examples of it, I would go to Maria's Bed, All I'm Thinking About, or Madame Morris Banks. There are a number of issues I have with The Ghost of Tom Joad that are kind of fixed here. Some issues that aren't. It's still pretty tough to make out what he's saying, which is just so irritating to me. It almost makes me feel like he's afraid of the lyrics he's written on some level, like that he's worried they're not profound enough, and that if he pronounces them clearly, people will pick up on that. Whether or not that's the case, it's like when a friend of yours is being a little bit too coy with you, like kind of intimating that they're having some kind of issue, but not being willing to just come right out and say it. And you're just like, I like you. I'm here because I like you. Tell me. Which does irritate me, I think, in large part because, just like The Ghost of Tom Joad, there's a lot of nuance and care in these songs. You know, there's songs about encounters with prostitutes, there's songs about hired assassins, there's a song about a sort of majestic, wonderful horse. When you can make out the words, a really lovely paean to his children. There are some sort of repetitive musical motifs that recur throughout this album, and the production environment does get a little samey, but this is really one of Springsteen's coziest albums. It serves a purpose that, frankly, no album to this point in his career serves. Nebraska is a richly textured production environment, but it's also spooky and eerie and a little bit demonic. Devils and Dust really feels like sitting around the family hearth. The Rising is a more towering and important accomplishment. It had a kind of broader national, emotional, cultural motive than this one does. If The Rising is a kind of emotional documentary that you watch in order to put your experience in the wake of a tragedy in context, this album is the blanket that you put over your lap as you're watching the documentary. Are you with me? I would put this just behind Greetings from Asbury Park in the B tier. 14. We Shall Overcome, the Seeger Sessions. This is an album consisting entirely of covers of songs that Pete Seeger sang or popularized. Pete Seeger was a legendary songwriter and activist who you can see portrayed by Edward Norton in the recent Bob Dylan biopic. It's the first album of entirely covers that Springsteen released in his career, as opposed to somebody like Bob Dylan, who recorded albums either entirely or mostly consisting of covers throughout his career. This is an appropriate collection of songs in large part because post The River, Springsteen was largely calling on the folk tradition as inspiration for his new song. On Nebraska, that's very aesthetically obvious. The songs, sound and feel sort of like modern Woody Guthrie songs. But even on Born in the USA, I think you can hear that. The songs are pretty structurally simple, pretty technically simple, but seek to tell stories about human beings suffering from the kinds of issues that the singer is concerned with. I think there are sort of two fundamental pillars of value on this album. The first is that if you're relatively new to the folk songbook, this is a good sort of primer. There are a number of just sort of stone cold folk classics on this album. John Henry, Shenandoah, We Shall Overcome. There are also a lot of songs here that are not necessarily super well-known classics, but that are just as wonderful to know about as those other songs. And the other pillar is that the album is just incredibly fun. Dylan's folk performances songs feel like an old folk singer that you happen to stumble upon in a coffee shop in the middle of nowhere. Very much the spirit of folk. It sounds like a disheveled, wandering ragamuffin who happens to be divinely talented. Springsteen's, on the other hand, feels like the most charismatic union leader you could possibly imagine. You know, somebody whom hundreds of thousands, millions of blue-collar workers will rally around as their galvanizing voice. Both of those personas have a sort of inherent folk credibility and realness that makes the songs come alive. All that being said, there are things I don't love about this album. I don't love Springsteen's affected Southern accent. I don't think it's inherently wrong for a person who does not have a particular accent to use a particular accent, especially when the person has a good understanding of the people who naturally have the accent that he's using. If the accent is a product of and proof of empathy, I think it's okay. If it feels more exploitative, I think that's where you get into trouble, where it's like if it's either making fun or it betrays a poor understanding of the people whose voices it's based on. That's when you sort of get in trouble. And in Springsteen's case, I don't think it's necessarily a poor understanding. I think it's more just that the accent is so clearly affected and so over the top that it's hard to suspend your disbelief like you would need to in order to believe that this person is the character. Besides which, I just don't think he needed to do that in order for the songs and the performances to sound credible. I almost wish he had had an acting coach who could have said to him, just like dial it back 2 or 3 points. Like, we get it, we believe you. You don't have to go that hard. I think my one other critique of it is that when the arrangements are good, it feels like the best big folk band that was ever assembled. But then when the arrangements aren't good, it feels kind of like generic folk rock. A certain kind of fiddle fill is played at this point because that's what you play at this point in this kind of song. I think at its worst, it can feel a little bit boilerplate. You know, even though, of course, it takes exemplary technical musicianship to deliver such boilerplate licks and arrangements, the sum total does occasionally feel that way. In general, this is an album that I reliably enjoy listening to. It spawned a really great live show. The Live in Dublin album is also very worth listening to. It's a great general education in folk music. It's a great sort of indication of Springsteen's own creative lineage, or one of the creative lineages that's important to him. It's for the most part incredibly fun. Sometimes it feels a little bit repetitive and predictable. This is another post-Tunnel of Love album that I think every Springsteen fan ought to give a chance, and ought to give, a pretty good and close listen, particularly if they have any kind of musicologist gene in their body. So if that's you, this is for you. Yeah, I would put this just behind Devils and Dust in the B tier. 15, Magic. There are a lot of songs on this album that bring me some kind of pleasure to listen to. Radio Nowhere is the best example of that. Imagine a world where Springsteen wrote Radio Nowhere in 1976. It has a kind of Because the Night energy that would have made sense alongside the other songs on Darkness on the Edge of Town. I think that had the song come out then, it would be regarded as a much more prominent classic than it is currently regarded as. Girls in Their Summer Clothes is kind of akin to I Wanna Marry You on the River. Long Walk Home is a sort of Reason to Believe type song, especially the way that he tends to play it in concert in a solo acoustic setting. He's doing a good job of reproducing styles that he's already done a good job of showcasing in the past. It's hard to say that the production is not an astute representation of the rock of the E Street Band, but it's also not necessarily a new representation of that. It's a little bit cleaner sounding and probably a little bit more complex and modern in terms of the ingredients it uses to create that representation. So what you wind up with is pretty expertly rendered rock music that is neither any better nor really any different than anything he's produced in the first 30 or so years of his career. People go too far in criticizing this music sometimes. Like they just sort of call everything post-Tunnel of Love sort of irrelevant or bad. This is neither irrelevant nor bad, but for somebody who's trying to wrap their head around what Bruce Springsteen is all about, it's also kind of a long way from essential. If somehow you were marooned on a desert island and this was the only album you had with you, I don't think that would be bad news at all. But if you had the choice to take a Springsteen album to a desert island, you would never choose this one. So that's an interesting dichotomy. There's nothing about it that feels essential, but there's also nothing about it that feels offensively bad. I would put it just ahead of The Ghost of Tom Joad in the C tier. 16, Working on a Dream. There are some new Springsteen sounds on this album. What Love Can Do almost sounds like a Guster song, similar with Life Itself. Good Eye is borderline Tom Waits blues type energy. It's not nearly as gritty and dirty as that, but it's sort of hinting in that direction. Tomorrow Never Knows kind of has Lumineers type folk energy. There are also several songs from this album that I would probably put on a best of Springsteen post-1987 album. My three choices would be My Lucky Day, The Wrestler, and The Last Carnival. A good microcosm of what I don't love about this album is Outlaw Pete. Outlaw Pete is a song that is epic in size and scope. It is the life of an outlaw, from when he is 6 months old to when he rides his horse off of a cliff in a sort of freeze-frame Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid type of way. It is cinematic in its sweep. It is orchestral in its production. It is, by all accounts, a sort of epic Springsteen outlaw song. However, it is kind of just one outlaw song cliche after another. Robbed a bank, had an enemy, had a lover that he sort of abandoned and who searches for him in the stars and calls out his name. Compared to something like Nebraska is quite a nuanced character study of a real serial killer. This is a relatively cliched story of an imaginary outlaw that Springsteen did not do a lot of really deep imagination work in bringing to life. Not that I don't think it took a lot of work to make that song happen, but there's nothing nuanced about the depiction of Outlaw Pete, which, by the way, is like sort of a dumb moniker. What outlaw calls themselves outlaw? Working on a Dream is another example of that. Compare Working on a Dream to Darlington County. Darlington County is, again, I waxed about Darlington County because I love how unusual and nuanced of a portrait it is of people who have a big dream that they can't quite realize, so they take an alternate route. Working on a Dream is like taking the most generic explanation of what that song, or what a lot of the songs on Born in the USA are about, and turning it into the basis for a new song. Just like Magic, this is not a bad album, it's not a lazy album. There are some gestures in entirely fresh musical directions, but not any really bold experiments that feel like entirely novel territory for him. Maybe with the exception of The Wrestler. The Wrestler is actually a pretty good character portrait, perhaps because he had an entire good movie's worth of character data to work from. For the most part, these songs are less multidimensional reiterations of themes that Springsteen has been working on for his entire career. I would put this in the very lowest place of his C tier. So I sort of think about Springsteen's 2000s this way. Through about Tunnel of Love, Springsteen is climbing the mountain. Call the mountain the music industry, call the mountain his realization as a popular musician, call the mountain, confronting and overcoming the emotional challenges that he and his family had been dealing with, or not really dealing with, for generations. It's hard to say that by the end of 1987, he didn't get to the top of at least one or two versions of the mountain. I hope you'll bear with me on this metaphor, but after that, it feels like Springsteen skiing down the mountain that he climbed, and then sort of taking the ski lift back up to the top of that mountain. Other artists, once they reach the top of a mountain, will go back down the other side, usually in a blaze of not so glorious, not so very good music. See Empire, Burlesque, and Knocked Out Loaded in Dylan's catalog, and then find themselves at the foot of another mountain, an unprecedented mountain both for them and for popular artists of any kind, and have to figure out a way to climb that one. Relatively few popular musicians have chosen to do that, probably because there is so much comfort and wealth and stability to be found by staying on the mountain you've already conquered. But if you choose to remain there, you wind up with a lot of the material that Springsteen produced this decade, most notably Magic and Working on a Dream, that's perfectly adequate from numerous perspectives, but not essential listening for people who already know the first several decades of your work well. Is this the most egregious example of an aging popular musician? Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. If you were stuck with only these albums to listen to, this is not bad music. It's neither bad nor totally uninteresting music, but it's also not categorically adventurous music either. If what you're looking for is highly adventurous, highly stimulating art, I would not be surprised if you sort of turn a blind eye to most of these albums. It kind of brings up the broader question of, if you're somebody who really likes Bruce Springsteen the artist, should you listen to his complete discography or shouldn't you? I guess, as always, it just sort of depends on who you are and what you're trying to get out of the music you listen to. For songwriters, there are a lot of interesting lyrical motifs and melodic motifs and production approaches in the albums throughout this decade. It's also interesting to analyze why these albums are not as resonant as other artists' late career albums, as the best late career albums, in my opinion. So you get something out of that analytic process too. But if you're not a songwriter and you're not somebody who derives a lot of pleasure from thorough sort of meta-analysis, if you will, there's not a lot for you here. I won't deny that. I think that the most essential album from this decade is The Rising. I think The Rising and Devils and Dust are oddly good companion pieces, even though they don't have a lot in common. I do think that the Seeger Sessions is borderline essential listening for anybody who wants a sort of entry-level class on folk music, and I'm sort of disappointed, if not altogether offended, by the ethos and the approach on Magic and Working on a Dream. Let me know in the comments what you think of my takes. I will not be offended by either agreement or disagreement if you do so thoughtfully. And now let's get to some of your comments. Matt05 writes, what do you think is worse, Dylan's 80s or Springsteen's 90s? What a wonderfully nerdy question. I think it's a complicated answer. I think that Dylan's 80s have both deeper valleys and higher peaks than Springsteen's 90s. Springsteen's 90s is pretty flat decade in my opinion, quality-wise. Dylan's 80s is a crazy roller coaster of quality. Some truly abysmal music. I mean, some of the stuff on Down in the Groove is just absolutely unlistenable. And then you got a song like Joker Man that I think is among his best songs ever written. Not just his best songs of the 80s, but his best songs ever written. You've got music that should practically never be heard by human ears. And then you've got music that should be heard by all human ears. You know, Springsteen's 90s is like well-intentioned, not super well-executed music for the most part. The two Springsteen songs that I take away from the 90s as really good examples of his compositional style are Better Days and Youngstown. But, you know, whereas I would put Joker Man alongside any of Dylan's best compositions, I would not put Better Days or Youngstown among Springsteen's best compositions. On Human Touch, Will Daly, what's up, Will, writes, I like to try to make a good 9-song album out of this and Lucky Town. Yeah, same. You know, the decision to release 2 full-length albums in the same day probably made sense at the time. It had been 5 years since he had released any new studio work. Pretty much what you have in retrospect is too much music that resonates too little and that artistically would be better suited for a single album. This is the single album that I would have made from these songs. I wonder what yours would be. On The Ghost of Tom Joad, Mac and Alex writes, I put this one over Nebraska somehow. Album cover F tier, though. Yeah, what is with that cover? I certainly don't put this over Nebraska, but I agree that the album cover is F tier. What also is interesting about Springsteen in general is that he's produced some of the most iconic and some of the least visually appealing album covers ever. You know, Greetings from Asbury Park, The Wildly Innocent, Born to Run, and Born in the USA are all excellent album covers in my opinion. Lucky Town, Human Touch, and The Ghost of Tom Joad are all, like, terrible. All of his album covers from the 90s are just pretty unimaginative, if not outright disgusting. Generally speaking, the later you get into his career, the worse the album covers get. That's not always the case, but it's largely the case. Magic and Working on a Dream are essentially the same cover with just some different photo filters applied to them. An album cover can go such a long way in putting the music contained within it in context, and it's just surprising to me that he's produced so many good ones and so many really forgettable ones. I wonder what you think are his best and his worst, and in general, too, if there are other really bad album covers by great artists that come to mind. Carburetor County Productions writes, it would be interesting to see how you would rank the new Trax albums against the rest of the discography. I do plan to do this. I want to work my way through the main canon first. I sort of view the tracks, both Tracks 1 and Tracks 2 material, as like Bob Dylan's bootleg series where it's sort of canon adjacent. So I will certainly get to it, but not right now. Thank you all very much, those of you who commented, for weighing in. If you would like to be included in a future comment section, please post any questions, clarifications, critiques, and hey, you might wind up in a future video. Thank you all very much for watching. Stay tuned for the next installment of the tier list in another couple of weeks or so, and I will see you next time.